Sarah Martinez stepped out of her silver Honda Civic and looked up at the imposing gray concrete building that would be her new workplace. Fort Davidson Military Training Center stretched across several acres with multiple training facilities, obstacle courses, and dormitories housing hundreds of young recruits. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly maintained grounds where groups of soldiers jogged in formation. Their synchronized footsteps echoed across the courtyard as drill sergeants barked commands that could be heard from a quarter-mile away. She grabbed her black leather briefcase from the passenger seat and checked her watch. 7:30 in the morning meant she had exactly 30 minutes before her first training session would begin. Sarah had arrived early on purpose because she knew this day would be challenging in ways that had nothing to do with military tactics or combat training. She smoothed down her olive green uniform and adjusted the sleeves to cover as much of her scarred left arm as possible. The scars were impossible to hide completely. Thick raised tissue ran from her wrist all the way up to her shoulder and continued across her neck toward her collarbone. The burns had healed years ago, but they remained angry and red in color. Some areas were smooth like melted wax, while others had a rough, bumpy texture that felt strange even to her own touch. Sarah had learned to live with them, but she knew that other people often stared or looked away in discomfort. Walking through the main entrance, Sarah was greeted by Sergeant Collins, who would be showing her around the facility. Collins was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes who had been working at Fort Davidson for over 15 years. He shook her hand firmly and welcomed her to the team without making any comment about her appearance. Sarah appreciated his professionalism and hoped that the recruits would show similar respect. The hallways were lined with photographs of distinguished graduates who had gone on to serve in various military operations around the world. Sarah recognized some of the faces from news reports about recent conflicts. The walls also displayed motivational posters with slogans like honor, courage, commitment, and images of soldiers in action. Everything about the facility spoke of discipline, tradition, and pride in military service. Collins led her to the instructor lounge where she would store her personal belongings and prepare for training sessions. The room contained several lockers, metal chairs, and a small kitchen area with a coffee maker and microwave. 2 other instructors were already there reviewing their lesson plans for the day. They introduced themselves as Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Thompson, both experienced trainers who had been working with new recruits for several years. Captain Rodriguez was a stocky Hispanic man in his 40s who specialized in weapons training and marksmanship. He had served 3 tours overseas and had numerous commendations for his service. Lieutenant Thompson was a tall blonde woman about Sarah's age who focused on physical fitness and endurance training. Both instructors were friendly and welcoming, making Sarah feel more comfortable about her first day. Collins explained that Sarah would be working with a group of 25 new recruits who had arrived just 2 weeks earlier. They were still adjusting to military life and learning basic skills like marching in formation, following orders, and maintaining their equipment. Most of them were between 18 and 22 years old and came from various backgrounds across the country. Some had joined the military right after high school, while others had attended college or worked civilian jobs before enlisting. The recruits were currently eating breakfast in the mess hall before reporting to the training ground at 8 o'clock. Sarah would have about 10 minutes to introduce herself and explain what they would be learning during their time together. Collins warned her that this particular group included several challenging personalities, including one recruit who had been causing problems since his arrival. Private Johnson came from a wealthy family and had only joined the military because his father insisted it would build character. He had a tendency to question authority and make inappropriate comments about other soldiers. Several instructors had already reported issues with his attitude and behavior. Collins suggested that Sarah establish clear boundaries immediately to prevent any problems from escalating. Sarah nodded and made mental notes about how to handle difficult recruits. She had dealt with challenging people before, both during her own military service and in her previous job as a security consultant. The key was to remain calm, professional, and focused on the training objectives rather than getting drawn into personal conflicts. At 7:55, Sarah walked toward the training ground where the recruits were already gathering. She could see them from a distance standing in loose groups and talking among themselves. Some looked nervous, while others appeared confident and eager to begin. A few were checking their equipment and making sure their uniforms met military standards. The training ground was a large open area with various obstacles and equipment stations set up for different types of exercises. There were rope climbing walls, balance beams, tire runs, and areas marked off for combat training. The ground was covered with a layer of sand and gravel that would cushion falls during physical activities. Tall floodlights surrounded the perimeter for evening training sessions. As Sarah approached the group, she noticed that several recruits glanced at her scars with curiosity or surprise. She had expected this reaction and tried not to let it bother her. Over the years, she had learned that most people were simply curious rather than intentionally cruel. However, she also knew that there would always be some individuals who would make cruel comments or judgments based on her appearance. The recruits quickly formed neat rows when they saw her approaching. Their conversations died down as they waited for instructions. Sarah took her position at the front of the group and looked out at 25 young faces that represented the future of military service. Some looked back at her with respect and attention, while others seemed distracted or disinterested. Sarah cleared her throat and began her introduction, knowing that the next few hours would set the tone for her relationship with these recruits. Sarah stood before the 25 recruits and began her introduction with a steady voice that carried across the training ground. "Good morning, recruits. I am Instructor Martinez, and I will be working with you over the next several weeks to prepare you for advanced military training." She kept her tone professional and authoritative while scanning the faces before her. Most of the young soldiers looked attentive and respectful, but she quickly identified the recruit Collins had warned her about. Private Johnson stood in the back row with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face that suggested he found something amusing about the situation. He was tall and lean with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking watch that caught the morning sunlight. Everything about his appearance suggested privilege and wealth, from his spotless uniform to his brand-new combat boots that had obviously never seen real action. Sarah began the morning training session with basic combat stances and defensive positions. She demonstrated each movement slowly and clearly so the recruits could follow along and practice the techniques. Her scarred left arm had limited flexibility, but she had learned to adapt her movements over the years. She could still perform all the necessary actions even if they looked slightly different from the textbook demonstrations. The recruits spread out across the training ground and began practicing the moves she had shown them. Sarah walked among them, offering corrections and encouragement as they worked to master the basic techniques. Most of the soldiers were eager to learn and asked thoughtful questions about proper form and timing. She noticed that several of them glanced at her scars with curiosity, but they remained respectful and focused on their training. Private Johnson, however, made no effort to hide his disdain. When Sarah approached his section of the training ground, he made exaggerated movements that mocked her slightly modified technique. He whispered comments to the recruits around him that made them laugh nervously and lose focus on their practice. Sarah decided to ignore his behavior for the moment, hoping that he would settle down as the session continued. During a water break, Sarah overheard Johnson talking loudly to a group of recruits near the equipment shed. His voice carried clearly across the open space as he entertained his audience with crude impressions of her movements. "Look at how she holds her arm," he said while making jerky motions with his left side. "Maybe they should have robots teaching us instead of people who are already broken." The other recruits shifted uncomfortably at his words. Some laughed nervously because they did not want to confront someone who seemed confident and popular. Others looked genuinely disturbed by his cruel comments and glanced towards Sarah to see if she had heard. A few brave souls tried to change. the subject, but Johnson seemed determined to continue his performance. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she had experienced much worse treatment during her recovery in military hospitals. She had learned to develop thick skin when it came to thoughtless comments and cruel jokes about her appearance. What bothered her more was seeing how Johnson's attitude was affecting the other recruits and creating a negative atmosphere within the training group. She resumed the training session as if nothing had happened, but Johnson's behavior only grew worse throughout the morning. He made subtle comments about damaged goods and questioned whether people with obvious injuries should be trusted to train future soldiers. His remarks were always just quiet enough that Sarah could not be certain she had heard them correctly, but loud enough for nearby recruits to catch every word. During weapons handling practice, Johnson deliberately fumbled his rifle and claimed that he could not follow Sarah's instructions because her damaged arm made her movements confusing. When she corrected his grip, he pulled away dramatically and announced that he preferred to learn from instructors who could demonstrate techniques properly without modifications. The noon break could not come soon enough for Sarah. She dismissed the recruits for lunch and watched them head toward the mess hall in small groups. Johnson walked with a cluster of followers who hung on his every word as he continued his commentary about their instructor. Sarah noticed that several other recruits deliberately chose different paths to avoid being associated with his cruel behavior. She sat alone on a bench near the training ground and tried to eat her sandwich while processing the morning's events. Sarah had expected some initial awkwardness as the recruits adjusted to having an instructor with visible injuries, but Johnson's behavior went far beyond normal discomfort. His comments were calculated to humiliate her and undermine her authority in front of the entire group. Sarah thought about her conversation with Collins earlier that morning. He had warned her that Johnson came from privilege and had never faced real challenges or consequences for his actions. His wealthy family had probably shielded him from criticism his entire life, leaving him unprepared for military discipline and respect for authority. However, understanding his background did not make his behavior any less hurtful or disruptive. As she finished her lunch, Sarah could hear Johnson's voice echoing from the mess hall windows. He was regaling a table full of recruits with his theories about military standards and fitness for duty. His words carried clearly across the courtyard as he questioned whether the military was becoming too soft by accommodating people with disabilities. Sarah knew she needed to address the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. Johnson's attitude was poison that would spread throughout the group if left unchecked. She had worked too hard to earn her position as an instructor to let one arrogant recruit destroy her credibility and effectiveness. The afternoon training session would focus on team-building exercises and cooperative problem-solving. Sarah decided this would be the perfect opportunity to demonstrate leadership and show the recruits what real military values looked like. She stood up from the bench and walked back toward the training ground with renewed determination to handle whatever challenges Johnson might throw at her next. The warm afternoon sun beat down on the sandy training area as the recruits began filtering back from lunch. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as Sarah gathered the recruits for team-building exercises on the main training field. She had carefully planned activities that would require cooperation and mutual trust among the soldiers. Her goal was to shift focus away from individual performance and toward group success, hoping this might reduce Johnson's opportunities for disruptive behavior. The first exercise involved pairs of recruits navigating an obstacle course while one partner wore a blindfold. The seeing partner had to guide their teammate through rope climbs, tire runs, and balance beam challenges using only verbal instructions. Sarah explained that this activity would teach them to communicate clearly under pressure and trust their fellow soldiers completely. Most of the recruit pairs approached the exercise with enthusiasm and genuine effort to help each other succeed. Sarah watched as nervous young soldiers learned to rely on their partners and offer encouragement when someone struggled with a difficult obstacle. The exercise was working exactly as she had hoped, creating bonds between recruits who had barely known each other 2 weeks earlier. Private Johnson, however, turned the exercise into another opportunity for mockery and disruption. When Sarah assigned him a partner, he immediately complained that he should not have to take orders from someone who could not demonstrate the obstacles properly herself. He made loud comments about blind leading the blind, while other recruits tried to focus on their own challenges. During his turn as the guide, Johnson deliberately gave confusing or incorrect directions to his blindfolded partner, causing the young soldier to stumble and fall multiple times. When Sarah intervened to correct his guidance, Johnson claimed he was simply following her example of modified instruction techniques. His sarcasm was obvious to everyone present, but he maintained just enough plausible deniability to avoid direct confrontation. The situation deteriorated further during the second team exercise, which involved groups of 5 recruits working together to carry heavy equipment across uneven terrain. Sarah had designed this activity to simulate battlefield conditions, where soldiers might need to transport wounded comrades or critical supplies under difficult circumstances. Johnson's group struggled from the beginning because he refused to coordinate with his teammates or follow the established plan. Instead of working as part of the team, he criticized every decision and suggested that their instructor's physical limitations made her unqualified to design realistic training exercises. His constant complaints distracted the other group members and made it impossible for them to complete the task successfully. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin as Johnson continued his pattern of disruption and disrespect. She had encountered difficult recruits before, but never someone who seemed so determined to undermine her authority and humiliate her in front of an entire training group. His behavior was affecting not only her ability to teach, but also the learning experience of 24 other young soldiers who deserved proper instruction. During a brief rest period between exercises, Sarah noticed Johnson holding court with his usual group of followers near the water station. His voice carried clearly across the training ground as he shared his opinions about military standards and qualification requirements. She could see other recruits glancing in her direction with expressions of embarrassment and discomfort. The breaking point came during the final exercise of the day, which involved individual combat demonstrations. Each recruit was supposed to show the defensive techniques they had learned that morning, while Sarah provided feedback and corrections. This was meant to be a positive conclusion to the training session where soldiers could display their progress and receive encouragement. When Johnson's turn arrived, he approached the demonstration area with his characteristic smirk and obvious lack of respect. Sarah began explaining the specific technique he should demonstrate, but Johnson interrupted her mid-sentence with a loud comment that silenced the entire group. "I still do not understand why someone who obviously could not protect herself in combat is trying to teach the rest of us how to fight," Johnson announced in a voice that carried across the entire training ground. If she was such a great soldier, then how did she end up looking like she went through a blender? The words hit Sarah like a physical blow to her chest. 24 recruits stood frozen in stunned silence as Johnson's cruel comment hung in the air between them. Several soldiers gasped audibly while others looked down at their boots in obvious discomfort. A few brave recruits glared at Johnson with clear disapproval, but no one spoke up to defend their instructor. Sarah felt her face burn with a mixture of anger, shame, and deep hurt. Johnson had found her most vulnerable spot and attacked it with surgical precision. The comment struck at her deepest fears about her worthiness as an instructor and her value as a person. For a moment, her carefully maintained professional composure cracked completely. Johnson seemed to sense that he had achieved his goal of breaking through her defenses. His smirk widened as he watched her struggle to maintain control in front of the entire group. He had successfully turned what should have been a positive learning experience into a moment of public humiliation for their instructor. The training ground remained silent, except for the distant sounds of other military activities across the base. Sarah looked out at the faces of her recruits and saw a mixture of sympathy, anger, and confusion. Some soldiers appeared ready to speak up in her defense, while others seemed paralyzed by the awkwardness of the situation. Sarah took a deep breath and tried to regain her composure, but the damage had been done. Johnson had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and had done so in front of witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their military careers. She realized that her authority and credibility as an instructor had been seriously undermined. The afternoon training session ended in uncomfortable silence as recruits gathered their equipment and prepared to return to their dormitories. Sarah dismissed them with a quiet voice that barely carried across the group, while Johnson walked away with obvious satisfaction at having achieved his goal of public humiliation. Sarah arrived at Fort Davidson before sunrise the next morning, hoping to find some peace and quiet before facing another difficult day with the recruits. She had spent most of the previous evening questioning whether she had made a mistake accepting the instructor position. Johnson's cruel words kept echoing in her mind, despite her efforts to push them away and focus on the positive aspects of teaching young soldiers. The parking lot was nearly empty at 6 in the morning, with only a few early rising staff members arriving for duty. Sarah was surprised to see a black military sedan with official government plates parked near the main entrance. The vehicle looked expensive, and officials suggesting that someone important was visiting the training facility. She wondered what kind of high-ranking officer would arrive so early for what seemed like a routine training day. Walking through the main entrance, Sarah was startled to nearly collide with a tall figure in dress uniform who was studying a clipboard full of papers. The woman looked up from her documents, and Sarah immediately recognized the distinctive insignia of a general officer. Her heart began racing as she quickly snapped to attention and offered a crisp salute. At ease, Martinez said, "General Patricia." Wells with a slight smile that seemed genuine and welcoming. Sarah relaxed her posture but remained respectful and alert as she tried to figure out why such a high-ranking officer would be visiting their basic training facility. General Wells was known throughout the military as a tough but fair leader who had risen through the ranks based on merit and exceptional service. The general explained that she was at Fort Davidson to review preparations for the upcoming graduation ceremony, where successful recruits would receive their assignments to specialized training programs. She had arrived early to observe some training sessions and evaluate the quality of instruction being provided to new soldiers. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized that Johnson would likely continue his disrespectful behavior even with a general officer present. General Wells asked Sarah to walk with her toward the training areas while they discussed the current group of recruits and their progress through the basic training program. The general's manner was professional but friendly as she inquired about challenges and successes Sarah had experienced during her first weeks as an instructor. Sarah tried to keep her responses positive and focused on the achievements of the recruits who were working hard and showing improvement. As they walked through the corridors lined with military photographs and motivational posters, General Wells shared some of her own experiences training new soldiers earlier in her career. She mentioned that every group contained a mixture of personalities and that learning to handle difficult individuals was an important part of leadership development. Sarah wondered if the general somehow knew about her problems with Johnson. They passed the mess hall where early rising recruits were already eating breakfast and preparing for the day's training activities. Through the windows, Sarah could see Johnson sitting at a table surrounded by his usual group of followers. Even from a distance, she could tell he was entertaining them with stories and jokes that probably involved mocking someone or something related to military life. General Wells commented that she had reviewed the personnel files of all the recruits in Sarah's training group and found them to be a typical mix of backgrounds and personalities. She mentioned that some soldiers came from privileged circumstances and needed time to adjust to military discipline and the concept of earning respect through actions rather than family connections or personal wealth. Sarah realized that the general was diplomatically indicating her awareness of Johnson's background and behavioral issues without directly criticizing a recruit or putting Sarah in an awkward position. The conversation suggested that higher-ranking officers were already monitoring the situation and evaluating how it was being handled by the training staff. As they approached the training ground, Sarah could see the recruits beginning to gather, in their usual formation. Most of them looked alert and ready to begin the day's activities, but she noticed Johnson arriving late and taking his position with obvious reluctance. He was talking quietly to nearby recruits and gesturing in ways that suggested he was already planning more disruptive behavior. General Wells mentioned that she would be observing the training session from the elevated observation deck that overlooked the main training area. The deck was normally used by senior instructors and visiting officials to monitor training activities without interfering with the normal flow of instruction. Sarah felt nervous knowing that a general officer would be watching her handle Johnson's inevitable challenges to her authority. The general wished Sarah good luck with the morning training session and walked toward the stairs leading to the observation deck. Sarah watched her climb the steps and take a position where she would have a clear view of everything that happened during the next few hours. The weight of being observed by such a high-ranking officer added another layer of pressure to an already stressful situation. Sarah looked out at the 25 recruits who were now standing in neat rows, waiting for instructions. Most of them appeared focused and ready to learn, but Johnson was already whispering comments to his neighbors that made them glance nervously toward the observation deck. She could tell that he was aware of the general's presence, but seemed determined to continue his pattern of disruptive behavior. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the temperature was already beginning to rise toward what promised to be another hot day of training activities. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward her position at the front of the group, knowing that the next few hours would be critical for her future as an instructor and her relationship with the recruits. She could feel General Wells watching from above as she began the day's training session with basic combat review exercises. Sarah demonstrated the techniques with her usual professional competence despite the limited flexibility in her scarred arm. Most of the recruits followed along attentively, but she could see Johnson preparing to begin another day of mockery and disrespect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Sarah could maintain her authority and effectiveness as an instructor, or whether Johnson's cruel behavior would finally succeed in destroying her credibility completely. Sarah began the morning training session with advanced defensive techniques, while General Wells observed quietly from the elevated deck above. The recruits spread out across the sandy training ground and began practicing the movements she demonstrated. Most of them worked diligently to master the complex combinations of blocks, parries, and counterattacks that would serve them well in real combat situations. Private Johnson, however, started his familiar routine of subtle mockery and disruption almost immediately. He made exaggerated movements that mimicked Sarah's slightly modified techniques while encouraging nervous giggles from the recruits around him. His behavior was calculated to undermine her authority without being obvious enough to warrant direct disciplinary action. Sarah tried to maintain her focus on instruction while ignoring Johnson's disruptive antics. She moved among the recruits, offering individual corrections and encouragement as they struggled to learn the challenging defensive sequences. Several soldiers were making excellent progress and asking thoughtful questions about timing and positioning that demonstrated genuine interest in mastering the skills. From the corner of her eye, Sarah could see General Wells taking notes on a clipboard while observing the training session. The general's expression remained neutral and professional, but Sarah wondered what she was thinking about Johnson's obvious lack of respect and effort. Having such a high-ranking officer witness the ongoing discipline problems made Sarah feel even more pressure to handle the situation effectively. During a brief water break, Johnson gathered his usual group of followers near the equipment storage area and began entertaining them with his commentary about the morning's training. His voice carried clearly across the open space as he made jokes about modified techniques and questioned whether people with obvious physical limitations should be trusted to prepare soldiers for real combat situations. The other recruits in Johnson's group looked increasingly uncomfortable with his crude humor, but none of them seemed willing to challenge someone who projected such confidence and social dominance. A few brave souls tried to change the subject or redirect the conversation toward legitimate training topics, but Johnson seemed determined to continue his performance. Sarah resumed the training session with team combat scenarios that required pairs of recruits to work together against simulated enemy attacks. She had designed these exercises to build trust and cooperation while reinforcing the individual techniques they had been practicing. Most of the recruit pairs approached the scenarios with enthusiasm and genuine effort to protect each other. Johnson's participation in the team exercises was half-hearted and disruptive as usual. He failed to coordinate properly with his assigned partner and made loud complaints about the unrealistic nature of scenarios designed by someone with limited combat experience. His comments were always phrased as constructive criticism, but delivered in a tone that made his contempt obvious to everyone present. The situation escalated during the final exercise of the morning, which involved individual demonstrations of the defensive techniques each recruit had learned. Sarah called the soldiers forward one at a time to show their progress, while she provided feedback and encouragement. Most of them performed well and seemed proud of their improvement since the beginning of the training program. When Johnson's turn arrived, he approached the demonstration area with his characteristic smirk and obvious reluctance to participate seriously. Sarah began explaining the specific sequence he should demonstrate, but Johnson interrupted her with a comment that was clearly intended to be heard by everyone, including General Wells, on the observation deck above. "I have to be honest, instructor," Martinez Johnson announced in a voice that carried across the entire training ground. "I am having trouble following your instructions because your movements look so different from what we learned in our textbooks. Maybe we could get someone without obvious disabilities to show us the proper techniques." The 24 other recruits stood frozen in stunned silence as Johnson's words echoed across the training area. Several soldiers gasped audibly while others looked toward the observation deck to see how General Wells was reacting to such blatant disrespect toward an instructor. The morning sun seemed to grow hotter as an uncomfortable tension settled over the entire group. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and humiliation, but she tried to maintain her professional composure despite Johnson's calculated attack on her credibility. She could see some recruits looking at her with sympathy, while others appeared shocked by the boldness of Johnson's public challenge to her authority as their instructor. Johnson seemed emboldened by the dramatic effect his words had created and decided to continue his assault on Sarah's reputation and qualifications. He turned slightly toward the observation deck as if addressing his comments to General Wells as well as to his fellow recruits gathered on the training ground below. The truth is, Johnson continued with growing confidence that he had found his target's weakness. "I think we all deserve to learn from instructors who can actually demonstrate combat techniques without modifications or limitations. How can someone who obviously could not protect herself in whatever situation caused those injuries be trusted to teach us how to protect ourselves and our fellow soldiers?" The silence that followed Johnson's cruel words was deafening. 24 recruits stared in horror at their classmate who had just crossed every line of military respect and human decency. Some soldiers clenched their fists in anger, while others looked ready to speak up in defense of their instructor, who had been working hard to help them succeed. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as Johnson's words struck at her deepest fears and insecurities about her worthiness as an instructor and as a person. For a moment, her carefully maintained professional facade cracked completely as the emotional impact of his attack overwhelmed her usual defenses against cruel comments about her appearance. General Wells had stopped taking notes and was now standing at the railing of the observation deck, looking down at the scene unfolding below. Her expression had changed from neutral observation to something much more serious and focused. Sarah could see the general slowly closing her notebook and preparing to take some kind of action. Johnson noticed the general's movement and seemed to realize that his comments had attracted the attention of the highest-ranking officer on the base. However, instead of showing appropriate concern or remorse, he maintained his arrogant smirk, as if he believed his wealthy family connections would protect him from any serious consequences. The training ground remained silent, except for the distant sounds of other military activities across Fort Davidson. Sarah stood facing her recruits, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether she could continue as their instructor or whether Johnson's systematic campaign of humiliation had finally succeeded in destroying her authority completely. General Wells descended the stairs from the observation deck with measured, deliberate steps that echoed across the silent training ground. Her polished black boots clicked against the metal steps as 25 recruits and their instructor watched her approach. The general's expression had transformed from neutral observation to something much more serious and purposeful. The recruits instinctively formed a perfect line and snapped to rigid attention as the general reached the bottom of the stairs. Their training had taught them to recognize the authority and respect due to a high-ranking officer, even in the most uncomfortable situations. Johnson maintained his position in the formation, but his arrogant smirk remained firmly in place as if he believed nothing serious could happen to him. Private Johnson General Wells began in a voice that carried the weight of decades of military service and command authority. You seem to have some concerns about your instructor's qualifications to train future soldiers. Perhaps I can provide you with some information that might help clarify the situation for you and your fellow recruits. Sarah felt her heart begin to race as the general walked directly toward Johnson without breaking eye contact. She had no idea what General Wells planned to say, but the officer's tone suggested that something significant was about to happen. The other recruits remained at attention, but Sarah could see their eyes following the general's movement across the training ground. Let me tell you about your instructor's background, General Wells continued while addressing the entire group. 3 years ago, Instructor Martinez was deployed with a Special Operations Unit in Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. Her call sign during that deployment was Phoenix, and she served with distinction in some of the most dangerous regions of that country. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard her old call sign spoken aloud for the first time in years. Phoenix was a name she had earned through months of dangerous missions and had carried with pride until the day everything changed. She had not expected General Wells to know about her service record or to share such personal information with the recruits. The general's voice grew stronger and more commanding as she continued her explanation. On March 15th, Phoenix was part of a humanitarian mission to evacuate civilians from a village that had come under heavy enemy fire. A school building that was being used as a temporary shelter took a direct hit from rocket-propelled grenades and immediately burst into flames. Johnson's smirk was beginning to fade as he realized that the general was not going to simply dismiss his comments with a mild reprimand. The other recruits remained perfectly still, but Sarah could see them listening intently to every word being spoken about their instructor's military service. Several soldiers glanced in her direction with growing understanding and respect. Phoenix led the rescue effort to extract civilians from the burning building, General Wells explained, while her voice carried across the training ground to every recruit in the formation. She personally entered the structure multiple times to carry out victims, including 4 children and 2 elderly villagers who could not escape on their own. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as painful memories flooded back from that terrible day in Afghanistan. The smoke and flames, the screaming voices, the weight of frightened children in her arms as she carried them to safety. She had tried for years to push those images away, but now they came rushing back with crystal clarity. On her final trip into the building, Phoenix was attempting to reach a family trapped on the 2nd floor when a section of the roof collapsed. General Wells continued. She was pinned under burning debris for nearly 20 minutes while the structure continued to burn around her. Despite her injuries, she refused medical evacuation until every civilian was accounted for and confirmed safe. The training ground was completely silent except for the general's voice and the distant sounds of military life continuing across Fort Davidson. Johnson's face had gone pale as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake in mocking someone whose sacrifice and heroism far exceeded anything he had ever done or was likely to do. Phoenix sustained severe burns, over 30% of her body during that rescue operation, General Wells announced while looking directly at Johnson. Her actions that day saved 8 innocent lives and earned her the Silver Star for exceptional valor under fire. She spent 14 months in military hospitals undergoing surgeries and rehabilitation before being cleared to return to active duty. Several recruits were now staring openly at Sarah with expressions of awe and respect that replaced their earlier discomfort about her scars. She could see them beginning to understand that the marks on her body were not signs of weakness or failure, but evidence of extraordinary courage and selfless service to others. The general walked closer to Johnson, until she was standing directly in front of him while addressing her final comments to the entire group. So when you question whether someone who could not protect herself should be teaching you how to fight, remember that you are speaking to a decorated war hero who sacrificed her own safety to protect innocent people. Johnson's arrogant expression had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of growing horror as he realized how badly he had misjudged his instructor. His face was flushed red with embarrassment and shame as the full weight of his cruel comments became clear to everyone present, including the general, who now knew exactly what kind of person he really was. I suggest you spend less time mocking your superiors and more time learning from them, General Wells concluded while maintaining eye contact with Johnson. You might discover that real courage and strength come in forms you are too immature and privileged to recognize or appreciate. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Johnson's stammered attempts at an apology and Sarah's quiet, tears of vindication after months of enduring his cruel behavior. The other recruits remained at attention, but their body language showed a new level of respect and understanding for their instructor, who had proven her worth in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. General Wells turned toward Sarah and offered a respectful nod that acknowledged both her service and her strength in handling an impossible situation with grace and professionalism. The morning sun continued to shine down on the training ground, where everything had changed in the space of just a few powerful words.